please have your attention? First thing, I'm really happy to see so many people, some new faces, some old faces. It's great, and you probably know like building a community is most important, and we have a really good community here, so it's great. So my name is John. I co-host the Data Science Meetup with Jason King and Lindsay Morris, who's not here unfortunately today. She's sick. And we just want to say welcome, number one. Second, we want to actually thank our food sponsor, Zach's company, Juice Analytics.
Yeah. That's full service. Food, presentation, entertainment, it's all there.
The Diet Coke was the best part.
All right, very good.
So I'm here to actually just introduce Zach, but I think Zach doesn't need an introduction, or he's better to introduce himself. So I'm going to pass it on, and please, we have lots of time after this to continue conversations. Again, half the experience here is meeting other people, which is why you guys are packed like sardines on purpose. So consider this a feature, not a bug. All right, so with nothing else, Zach.
Thank you, John. And thank you, everyone, for showing up. I love it that everyone's all packed in here and not way back there. So it's great. And I have a whole bunch of visual content, so it's great that you're close. So I will start by introducing myself a little bit. I'm going to tell you a little. I tried to boil down my Juice career into 3 parts. If this is a little bit of like a before and after picture, what happens if you've been running business for 15 years. So if you're thinking about starting a company, just keep in mind the wear and tear that it's going to take on you. But we started the company in 2005, and it was really from the beginning of the company, we wanted to focus on helping people communicate data, and we saw a problem with people putting a lot of effort into gathering data and struggling to present that and getting people to take some action on it. So that was what we set out to do a long time ago when we were young. Not quite as long ago, we wrote a book called Data Fluency. So this is a book that is about helping companies use data more effectively, all the way from thinking about how you visualize data effectively to how you the culture of an organization in order to get people more engaged with making decisions with data. And then what we're really about now as a company is we're about a data storytelling platform that we built that's called Juicebox. This is what we think about all day, is how do we make it so that people like you in a room like this can take data, build really great interactive data stories, and share those with the people that you want to influence. So I can talk about that after the presentation, but that's what we focus on right now, that solution. So I thought I'd start out by antagonizing this audience a little bit. This is a headline that I ran into a while ago. Forget data scientists, hire a data translator. Now that's, it might be a bit strong to say forget data scientists, but the point is that there is this need, there's this emerging role in being able to take the data and take the analysis or models that you put together and find better ways of being able to communicate those, translate those to the people, all the people who don't work with data, and that is most everyone. So that data translator role, we feel like, is something that's really becoming more and more important. And when we talk about data stories, that is really, we're talking about a tool and a technique to be able to be an effective data translator. So that's really what I'm going to talk about today. Data stories to help you be a data translator. I want to start with the term data stories and give you kind of lead up to how I define it and how we think about it, and what we can learn from traditional stories and how that influences effective data stories. Then I want to get into, as you start to think about building your own data stories or communicating data in this way, how do you structure data stories? So we have a framework and approach that we think about for structuring those data stories. What are the building blocks in order to construct a data story? So if you think of it like building a house, there's the frame, and there's all the parts that fill in around that frame. We'll talk about that. And then I got a great surprise at the end of this. We have a great fun game that we're going to play. So pay attention. If you pay attention, you're more likely to win the game. That's all I'm going to say for now. It'll be great fun. So, what are data stories? I'm going to start with a question here, so raise your hand high if you would. What do you think of when you think of data stories? Who thinks it's kind of data journalism that you might run across? Data stories. Nobody. All right. How about data visualizations with descriptions? A few people. Does anyone want to go back to data journalism? Vote on that. Might get worse from here. About interactive tools to explore the data. Yeah? There you go. Oh, John believes in that. How about, this is just a made-up thing that we're just talking, we're just bubbling this up, trying to sell something. All right, well, when I think about it, I think about data stories, and I'll expand on this, but I think of data journalism. So I'll show you a bunch of examples from data journalism. We get a lot of. I think the difference in the world that we exist in is that we want to give data stories that give our readers of that more control and more flexibility, more agency as they explore those stories. Certainly their data visualizations are a really critical building block of data stories. But to me, that's what it's a component, it's a brick in that house that you're building for a data story. There are a lot of other parts to building a data story besides the data visualizations, and putting those visualizations together into a story is the real challenge and what I'll talk about. There are certainly interactive tools that allow you to explore data. Spectrum that people talk about in our business between exploratory data analysis and explanatory data analysis. To me, data stories are much more about the explanatory. So you're closer to trying to explain what the data says and what it means to your audience. Yeah, so it's also a made-up thing to get people excited. So data stories. The question that I feel like when I started to think about how to define data stories was, what can we learn from the traditional stories? So think about books and movies and all the ways that we consume stories currently. There must be something there in the way we do that is the reason why people are so excited about data stories. So what can we pull from the way stories are normally told to add something to data storytelling? But it's not the same thing. It's not, a book or movie is not the same thing as what you would put together in order to explain data. And there are some really critical differences. So I want to highlight both the overlap and the differences. And how do you highlight overlap and differences? With this chart. It leads to that. So data stories, they have a lot in common with traditional narratives. And I want to talk about this and show you a few examples. Flow. So if you think about a story, there's a flow that occurs kind of across time that you see in a story. Stories set context. They have a structure. All these are some of the concepts that we might not think a lot about when we're experiencing a story or experiencing a movie, but these are things that should be there in a good story and should be there in a good data story. So let me show you what these things kind of mean to me when it's translated into the data story world. So a good story has flow. They have cliffhangers, and literally cliffhangers. Where you're trying to understand, what's going to happen next. That's what pulls you through a story. There's a sequence that someone goes through. The dashboards that we experience and the reports that are sent out so often don't do that. There's just like no place in a dashboard like this to say what's going to happen next, or what is the flow that I should experience in going through that. Let me show you an example of a data story that has some of that flow. This is a site that was put together to look at a bunch of data about the challenges women face. They have a very explicit flow that they built into this. So, the really kind of direct way about thinking of it is to sequence a bunch of insights. So the way they put it in here is you literally step your way through one step at a time, talking the user through the data, and at each step they're showing the evidence on the right and summarizing it, but telling that story, walking someone through it. So there's a very clear place to start at one, and then you move your way through it. So a good story has flow. A good story also should set the context. So most books, movies, plays they're going to set the scene, right? They're going to tell you where are you and who are the main characters and what is the big question that is at stake in this story. So that's what I think about with context. This is a screenshot from a visualization, a thing that the New York Times put together, where they're very good at just starting off with telling you what is this thing about. So setting the stage as to what's going to go on before you dive into it. So if you think back to that dashboard that I showed you, again, a lot of dashboards are just like, here's all the data, and they aren't saying what is the question, what is the problem that we're trying to solve. I'll talk a little bit more later about all the pieces that should be, the questions that should be answered in the context of a story. Story has structure, so it has this flow where you set things up. There's this traditional 3-act story structure that we're probably all familiar with, that we certainly experience all the time. At the beginning, there's some action that occurs, there's a conflict that occurs in the middle here, and then ultimately that conflict gets resolved. That's a structure that's kind of deeply embedded in how we like to absorb information. So when we think about data stories and making them an engaging way of absorbing data, we want to tap into these psychological ways that we're accustomed to absorbing stories. So the structure. I came across this there's this great site called Pudding that has a lot of visual storytelling and data storytelling. One of the interesting points, they had this really cool story about a comic and kind of how the structure of a stand-up act gets put together. And they had this one kind of view that I thought was really summed this up, where if you think about someone like Mitch Hedberg, or these kind of one-liner comics, think of that like the one visualization that you might send someone. It kind of stands alone. It doesn't have the context. It doesn't tie together, but really powerful comedy or stories are going to connect a bunch of things together and that kind of builds up across time to have more emotional impact than a single one-liner joke. It's a structure. A good story should have meaning. One of our inspirations for around storytelling is Pixar. Pixar is a whole company that's kind of built around being able to create high-impact stories. They have an incredible kind of methodology around it. A little while ago, they released I forget, it was like 21 different key principles about how they tell stories. And this was one that really struck me, that when they're evaluating and critiquing a movie that they're putting together, they're asking this question of like, is there a really critical reason, especially for the director and the people who are the kind of creative powers behind the story, of why they need to tell this story? Like, what is the essence of this that you're trying to get across? I think this is a question to ask yourself when you're delivering data to people. I think the problem that occurs so often is that people have a pile of data, they have some people who are asking for that data, and they feel like they can just send that over in some way without thinking about what is the core message. Why do I need to do this? Has to have meaning. A good story brings specificity. This is one of my favorite quotes. When you think about telling a story, if you leave things at a very abstract level, it's very hard for people to get some emotional connection to it. So I want to show an example that I really like that I feel like highlights this. So this is, you might not in the back be able to see this so well. This is a visualization about gun deaths. It's a little bit of an old visualization, oldie but a goodie. But it has a very distinct way of telling this story. So I'll just restart that just so you can get another view of it. They're showing one data point at a time, and then they show a few more, and those specific things, and they have names associated with it. So they're being very specific about an example before. Once they've sort of taught you as a reader what they're showing and making that connection with you, they're showing all the rest of it. They're adding up all the numbers, and that has a lot more impact to me than if they just showed you these total numbers. Then if they show you the total numbers, it doesn't feel like something that there are people behind those numbers. So you want to think about that as you're communicating data. Like, what can I take this down to the individual thing that I'm looking at and show some examples of that? Specificity. Here's another. I've got another example. I forgot. I got another example. I just came across this recently. This is a story about inequality. But they do this really cool thing where as you scroll through this, they gradually zoom in, and they keep zooming in, and then they take you all the way down to an individual country, and then they take you down to an individual person. So the impact of that, that's, now you're looking at a face. Now you're thinking of this as an actual human problem versus something that's just a bunch of data on a map. And this is another one of my favorite quotes. Data isn't like your kids. You don't have to pretend to love them equally. We can admit to that, or we can not admit to it. But with data, it is very easy for people to fall in love with their data. They've done a lot of work. Often there's all this work of gathering the data, cleaning the data, doing the analysis, building the model. And by the time you get to the end of that, you've sort of fallen in love with all the parts of the data and all the values or fields or variables you might have in there. In a data story, you want to be really cognizant of your audience and of the people who you're delivering this to who are not as in love with the data as you are, who haven't thought about it at all, who don't have the time or the energy to get as invested and think about what is the essence, how do I cut this back to the very essence of what I need to show. So data, those are a lot of the things that I feel like are the overlap parts. There are also some things that I think are different. So you can tell a story and it can have supporting data, but the kinds of data stories that I'm thinking about often bring the audience more into the discussion. So one of the analogies I'll use a lot is this idea of a choose your own adventure book. Do you guys remember the choose your own adventure books? I grew up on those. I love those. That was an opportunity. You read a section, then you have a choice. You decide how you're going to construct this story. You can go back and you can fix the path so you actually survived, and then you're done with the book once you found the end. A lot of data stories are about giving the audience some control, some sense of the ability to make it relevant for them as they're interacting with the data, and so that they get more out of it. Now, there are some data stories where it's much more of a telling kind of story, but we will sometimes use this term story finding in the sense that you're giving someone who's reading that story a space in order to find stories that are relevant to them. So the dynamic is a little different than just telling someone. And this is kind of one of the ways that we do it, where we'll have early on in a data story, we might give someone a set of selections or options of things that are relevant to them. You could put that as part of a sentence. So then someone comes in here and they're able to select the metrics they care about or some filters, whatever, defining kind of what they care about so that the story that they get into is really relevant to what they care about. So that's data finding, and I'll show some more examples of that. Data stories can be very different from telling someone a story in the sense that those stories can change. If the data is updating, that story is going to evolve. The kind of takeaways or what someone can get out of the story is going to change over time. I'll show you this application a little later. This is an application where we had pulled a bunch of data about Twitter followers, and every time there's a Democratic debate, the numbers start changing, and the numbers go up and down, and what you would take away from that story is going to change. So that's another distinction from, you read a book, what you take away from it is unlikely to change. And then the last thing, this is sort of a philosophical thing for how we think about building stories, in that we feel like if you're in a position, you have some data, you've done an analysis, and you put together a data story, what you're really trying to do is make it so that the person who gets that data story can be more effective in their job. So they can make smarter decisions. They can be the hero by using the data that you have provided. So it's a little bit of a selfless kind of perspective, but I think a lot of times you're trying to empower the audience and make them a hero. And if you make someone else a hero, it's going to reflect well on you for sure. But having that idea that you're trying to empower other people to be better at their jobs it's certainly a different concept than you would think about with traditional stories. So this is where we kind of land on this as a definition of what is a data story. I've often thought of this as a safari, that if you're the author of a data story, you're guiding your audience through the wilderness of data. And when you think about all the people who are uncomfortable with data out there, your job is to take them through that environment, show them places on that safari trip where they can have insights and take pictures of cool things and take those stories home with them. And you're using, as a data story, you're using these techniques of traditional storytelling in order to guide people through your data. So that's kind of the definition of the way we think about data storytelling. So then the question is, how do you build a data story? So that's all. It's all very abstract, but let's talk a little bit about if you're in a role where you've done some work with data and you want to deliver that and present that in a different kind of way. How do you think about that differently? So I want to share a little bit about how we structure that. I think the first thing is to build on this idea of the 3-act play. Build on this structure people are so accustomed to, of having an introduction that sets the stage, that defines the question you're trying to answer, helps them through this kind of conflicted, and sometimes called the messy middle of what happens, of being able to explore the data and find insights that are relevant, but ultimately get them to some resolution. And that's really the most important point, is you're guiding them to take some action on the data, and you want to lead them through that. So if those are the steps, the way we talk about a data story is that you're going to set the stage with some context. You get to the heart of your analysis. the really core of what you want to show someone or let someone explore in the data. And then you want to lead them to some data that they can take some action on. So people talk about actionable data all the time. I think that putting that, ultimately, you want to kind of put that in the forefront of your thinking. Where are you going to lead someone so they can do something with your data? So let me show you an example and kind of show you how that plays out. Again, the New York Times has all these great examples. So I have a whole bunch of examples from them, but there are other sites that do really great data stories. So this is an example, and where there's context, there's the heart of the data story, and then there's the action that you should take based on that. So the context is right up here. We're saying we're setting the stage, we're posing a question. Not only that, the context can include the flexibility to choose what you want to look at. So in this case, you could choose the state you want to look at. That kind of tees things up. The heart of this data story is pretty much everything else. It's an interactive story that lets you explore, kind of put in some numbers and see what that means. So we'll go ahead and do that. How much does housing cost? Does anybody, who wants to say $40? I'm out of touch. Let's say, monthly, it says monthly, yeah. $1,000 we'll say, okay. That's sure if you want to spend your whole budget on it. Utilities and services, $200. Those are big spenders. $65 a month, thank you. That was fantastic. All right, so do you want any health care? No health care. What else is important here? We have pizzas, so you can take a pizza home. Beer, it's, I said there's free pizza. All right, it's $100. It only gets worse. So this is it doesn't take much, obviously, in this story to get to a place where you don't have where you're out of money. And so there's this interaction. You're letting someone define what's relevant to them, and then you're showing them the results of that. That's what I would consider the heart of the analysis, the heart of the data story. And then the action, does anyone see where the action is on here? Or someone said it.
Make more money.
Make more money, that's right. So get debt, or better yet, 5 more hours a week at a second job. I assume it gets a lot worse than that. So that's the action. Now, in a thing like this, that's not a very pronounced action, but there's something that says, what does it mean? Like, what should you take away from this experience? So that's those 3 parts: the context, the heart, the story, and the action. I'll give you another example. This is a guy I know put this together this is a very simple thing. We're setting the context. They're saying it's going to get hotter, you guys. Put in your location, choose kind of what you want to look at. The heart of this is basically like, this is what it means for you. So there's going to be, historically, there have been 8 days over 100 degrees. In the middle of this century, you can look forward to 59 days above 100 degrees. And at the end of the century, it's going to be a bunch of the year. So that's the heart of it. And then for them, they're trying to get you to they're trying to motivate you to do something. So there's actually like a specific take action from there. So those 3 parts again. Yeah. John.
Yeah, so in traditional storytelling, right, there's the concept of a villain,
Oh, yeah.
the concept of a hero, which is your user, I guess, the audience, and then a climax. Is that how you're mapping this intro and that's the one here? Because once you identify the villain, that's much more compelling. And, that's how.
Yeah, I think there's often a conflict.
Yeah.
And the conflict may be between a villain and, but I think it's a little hard, and this is probably not a thing that I felt like I wanted to map onto data stories, is like that concept of characters as much. And I think, but there is that conflict, and the conflict could be kind of between the hero and the villain, I guess.
So like, there's Darth Vader. Then of course, the hero is Luke, I guess, and or all this, whatever. And then there's C-3PO, which I guess is what the storyteller is. Is that? Did you use that analogy?
I'm going to have to work on the mapping of Star Wars to data storytelling. Really. Yes, please.
I know what John said, a very essential part of storytelling is the audible. Data visualization tools, where is the audible portion of that?
Audible,
Yes.
like the listening part of it.
Mm-hmm. Because I'm saying traditional storytelling in the olden days was all about speech.
Certainly. I would view storytelling goes across a lot of different mediums. That is audible stories is a form of that. Written stories is a form of storytelling. And in some ways we're saying, so the medium, or the sort of the raw materials of your story, in this case is data, in that case is audible. Now, I've often wanted to add to our technology and to our data stories some audible element, because I actually think engaging people with different in different ways with the visual and the audible and the other, can be a way to capture people's attention. Any other questions?
I was just thinking, couldn't you think of the villain as the thing preventing whatever change you want somebody to take? Or the negative outcome of whatever your story is?
Yeah, and I think often the villain, or often the conflict is inside of the hero, right? A lot of his storytelling is about the change that your hero has to go through. So one way to think about it would be that what you're trying to do with the data story, because your audience is the hero, is you're trying to change through the process of the story, you're trying to change their attitudes. And as you probably know, when you're delivering data to people, often you're going against a set of assumptions that they have about the way the world works, and the data is trying to, it conflicts with those assumptions, and the data story maybe is kind of the way of, so I don't know if there's always like, a villain feels a little specific, but a conflict that you need to resolve or a change that you need to occur feels common, it feels like a thing. Awesome questions. Yeah, all right. Let's keep it going.
Be careful not to skew the facts using people's emotions with too much of a story, too much of a villain, too much of a hero, too much bias view of the data.
Yeah. This is we can go down a deep tunnel on this one for sure. So. Certainly when you're telling a story, you are bringing yourself to that story. You're bringing your own opinion. You're bringing the message that you want to bring. I can also argue that any time you're presenting data to someone, whether you're presenting it, dashboard reports, results from a model, you are bringing your biases are built into that, right? So any mode of communication kind of builds in those biases. Now with storytelling, in some ways I'm arguing storytelling is a more powerful way of influencing people and guiding people. But it's still, that potential still exists that you use it in a bad way. It's like we can go back to the Force if we want on this stuff. Good versus evil.
The villain could be the storyteller then.
If you want to, yes, if you want to abuse it, with great power comes great responsibility. No, it's a question that's come up a bunch. Is like you're saying, like I think there's a thing that people wrestle with, which is like, well, the data is I want to be objective with the data, but the truth is, at some level, you're making choices, and therefore you're being subjective about what you communicate. And I think you need to do that with kind of in good faith, and truthful to the data, but recognize also that you, like, as an author, you are defining the message and what you want to communicate. Yeah, that's the good stuff. So you want to set the context. We showed a few examples of setting the context. This is to show. I got another example. This is great. This is kind of a fun site that shows how people what people search on about cats and dogs. They have this little introduction, and then in setting the context, they're of course making you make a choice between cats or dogs. What do you guys want to look at? Oh, it's my kind of audience. Winner. And then they sort of dive into it from there. But the setting of the context is really just like, what are you going to see here? What is this thing about? And show and tell me, you're trying to elicit from someone what they care about in this story. Finding the heart. So the heart is I think the trickiest part of constructing a data story. Defining that context is sort of like, you should be able to know what the question is, and that flexibility. The heart is creating the set of visuals or the ability for someone to interact with and explore the data in such a way that they're likely to find the interesting insights and the aha moments, the insights that are going to change how they think. We were working recently on a little data story about the NBA, and we had some data about whether players were clutch or not. So in the last 5 minutes of games, in the last 5 minutes of tight games, how did they perform relative to the rest of the game? So that was sort of the data set we were working with. And one of the ways to think about the heart is to say, what insights could someone pull out of that type of data that would really surprise them, that would change how they think about their players? So if you think about what are the turning point insights that would really make them make different types of decisions, you can start to ask the types of questions, is my top scorer my most clutch performer? If they're not, if you can show that and they're not, that's going to be really insightful for the person. It is, absolutely. What types of players would I want to draft to draft clutch players? So you sort of want to brainstorm what are the types of questions that if we knew the answer to those, it would change how people think about things. Those are kind of the heart of the application. The interesting thing for us, as we've built lots and lots of these data stories and thought through this, is there are kind of patterns that emerge of the common ways that people like to explore and analyze data. So this is comparisons is a super important way, super core way of how we often will show data stories or the heart of data stories. But there really aren't that many ways, I think, when it comes down to it, that you want to let someone be able to explore and find those types of insights. The one that we find kind of most common across all the work that we do is a little tiny workflow that where someone wants to first look at what the key metrics are. So they want to see how they're performing on some key metrics and how those metrics compare, not shown here, but how they compare to goals or their expectations or last year or something. So metrics compared to things. Then for the metric that they care about or that's not performing well, they want to show how that breaks out. So, which is really about finding what are the underlying factors that are driving that lack of performance. And then they want to be able to look at that across time and be able to select those factors and see whether those are persistent problems or new problems. So this just kind of sequence of visuals is a kind of really common way that we found that people want to be able to explore data. So you have the heart of the story, and then the question is, how do you lead to action? This woman, her name is Nancy Duarte. She's a really great presenter of data and telling stories. the way she phrases it is asking this question when people are kind of talking about the information. She sort of poses this question, therefore we need to do what? And that's, like, I think a big part of your job as data storytellers or data translators is to push people beyond just looking at data and feeling like, well, that's interesting. Getting beyond just interesting, getting to, okay, now that I know that, I know what I need to do about it. So there needs to be some next step beyond interesting. And actions for us, they come in lots of different flavors. So an action doesn't have to be someone goes and pulls a different lever and therefore something improves. Sometimes an action can be, it starts a new conversation. It gets people talking about things in a new way, whether that's talking about the data in a new way or talking about the insights that they've found in the data. It can be about building lists of things. So very commonly, you're analyzing a bunch of customers, and you want to find the customers who are most at risk of churn or something, and building a list of people or things that are the things that you want to do something about. It's a very common kind of action in a data story. Or you could be building a set of different insights that you found that you want to go do something, an action plan itself. Or your data story can be about facilitating meetings. It could be about driving a workflow. So the flavors, like the actions come in kind of these different varieties, but I think thinking about what are you guiding someone to, what is the thing you want someone to do after they've looked at the data is pretty key. Before I wrap up this section, there's just a couple things that come up a lot that I'd like to address. One is we have this structure, and then it's a really reasonable question to ask, well, what if the person I'm presenting this to doesn't have the time to be going through a whole data story? It feels kind of indulgent sometimes to imagine that someone's going to walk their way through and be moved by a story. And that's fair, and in a lot of contexts, that's true. The way I approach it is to say that maybe that context just needs to be a little tiny mini version of your story where you strip away to the core question and you show someone the core insight that you found in the data and you tell them what they should do about it. And rather than asking someone to always navigate through the entire data story, you summarize it all in the same structure, but summarize it in kind of a little miniature, really top-level information way. So you can get a little cute little story there. And the last point I'd like to make is that I think it's very easy in the data visualization world, and especially with a lot of tools that exist out there, to take your data and start making a lot of charts. And this is the way most people approach this is that they start making a lot of charts, and then they try to figure out what do those charts say, and how do I fit them together, and can I get away with presenting 30 different pages in my PowerPoint? Well, that'd be good. Probably people will appreciate that. And you sort of just pile up a whole bunch of visualizations. And the thing that I found that's so useful is before you start creating charts, before you visualize anything, write it down. Write down the story you want to tell just in text. What's that starting question? What are the set of questions you're trying to answer as you let someone explore the heart of it? What are those actions you expect someone to take? And just write that out like you're writing the outline of a paper. And that will help you understand, have you really gotten to the heart of what you want to say? Does it have meaning? Can you be concise in what you're trying to do? It's a good way of not letting the whole kind of process of storytelling spin out of control. So let me, how are we doing on time? We good? We good? 7 o'clock. 7 o'clock. All right. I want to get to the fun part. So I'm gonna walk through. A data story is built out of a whole bunch of pieces, and I want to just give you a few kind of perspectives on what those pieces should be, I have slides for all these. This is a preview of what I'm going to say right there. So I think the first thing is that a data story, it's not all about the data. It's about, often there's a lot of pieces that are gluing that data together. So the images that you might want to show that help people understand what you're talking about, recommendations that you might include, help, text, notes, explanations of what people are looking at. These are all the pieces that bind together the data, the visualizations that you might show of your data. So you don't want to forget that stuff. Of course, you want to pick the right chart to do the job. This is one of the very first things we did at Juice was we created this little tool called Chart Chooser because everyone kept asking us, what's the chart that I should choose? And we're like, oh, it's not that hard. Build a little online tool. There are dozens of these things out there that will help guide you through the question you're trying to answer in your data and what is the right visual approach to be able to do that. So picking the right chart is certainly, and making it look good, is certainly an important part of it. There are right and wrong answers, in my view, of what the right chart is, the wrong chart. There's a lot of research behind this. We all know that by now, I think, that pie charts, while not evil, are limited in when they are good. Is that a good way to put it? I found the villain, John. There's the villain. The Darth Vader of your data story is the pie chart. Pie charts are perfectly fine if they're used in certain circumstances, but there are lots of places where people don't do it. And you can be deceptive if you're using the wrong type of chart. So this is actually a really nice thing that Google put out that walks you through some lessons about the good and bad choices you can make about visualizing data. I'm a big believer in thinking a lot about what is the right metric that you're showing in your data story. The metrics, to me, might be the characters in your story. I'll have to think more about that. But picking a metric that is easily understood, that is something somebody can do something about, that is not super complicated to be able to calculate. These can make a huge difference, and they can make a huge difference in telling the story. So using an index instead of absolute values, for example, can really help you highlight the changes. So thinking about the right metrics for your story. When you're visualizing data, less is more almost always. So less visual distraction, less use of lots of different colors, less asking someone to figure out what this chart does. I'm going to come back to that in a second. And back to that point earlier, less data, just like boiling it down to the essence of it as much as possible. Less is more. However, sometimes a kind of non-traditional, more complicated visualization can really be impactful. And one of the things that I've seen as a really kind of best practice is if you are going to teach someone or ask your audience to learn how to look at data in a new way, show them that, but then you can use that over and over again. So there's this really cool thing, visualization. This is a thing the Pudding put together. They have this visual approach where they show how basketball players sort of progress through, the top level basketball players progress through college, and then whether they got drafted and where they ended up in the NBA. So they show you, and this is, so it takes a moment to understand what this means and what's going on with this. I've been calling this a Plinko chart. But then as you scroll through it, they take that exact same visual now that they've taught it to you, and they use it again, and now they're looking at the top 10 players, and now they're looking at the players who went straight to the NBA from high school, and showing, so you're going to be pulling out different insights from each of these times that they iterate over this. But you don't, once you've kind of gone through the exercise of learning what these things mean, as a reader, you get it, and then you can focus on what the story is actually telling you. Sometimes people get in this scenario where they're building a dashboard or some sort of analytical tool, and they feel like they need to put variety of charts in there, really just like for the sake of variety, and I would discourage you from doing that. It's not about variety. So that's it's really cool. There's another concept that I feel like really good data stories do is they make the data, they think about ways to make the data relatable to people. So the one on the left is an example. There's this site that will show you different land masses on top of other land masses, and due to different map projections, we can kind of have concepts that, China is just as big as Africa or whatever, but here we're seeing when you actually overlay it, you can see that China and the United States and India all fit within Africa, so it's taking references that we think we understand and then connecting those to the point you're trying to make. This is a visualization, kind of a story that New York Times put together that's about how much water it takes in order to create different kinds of produce. The thing that I think they did really nicely was instead of saying bushels of this or pounds of garlic cloves, they're showing kind of serving sizes. So it's like things that we can understand as things that we use, and then gallons is a measure that we can also picture in our mind. So using things like that, where instead of saying something is some trillion something, can we say we hear this all the time, like, well, if you stacked something up, it would go to the moon and back. These are ways of getting people to wrap their head around big numbers, but sometimes smaller numbers. You want to make those relatable as well. And then I want to show you one more. Not that one. This one. This is kind of an old data visual story that I came across recently that, for one thing, it does a great job of pulling out takeaways. So it's very explicit about what it wants you to do at every step in this process. The way it works is you scroll through this, and at each step, it shows you how many swings Derek Jeter took in his career. And it zooms out, and it keeps zooming out. And off to the left, they're telling you the little takeaway they want for you to get at each stage. So it's a really cool way. But the fact that they have these takeaways on the left, I think, is really key. Talking about data being relatable, they have this little phrase here that I think is a good example of that. To see every swing, you would need to watch this motion nonstop for more than 4 days. Better make some coffee. So, they're giving you that sense of like, that's a lot of swings. Takeaways. All right, so that was a lot of content to absorb, but you guys did, I'm sure of it, and we're going to test you now. So this is something I want to try out. I'm trying this out for the first time. I think it'll be great. So, Amanda, my lovely assistant, sorry. We're going to play a little game called Data Storytelling Bingo. And there's a gift basket for the winner. Does everyone know how to play bingo? We all play bingo, I'm sure. It's on my weekend. Gift basket, a couple books, T-shirt, socks stuffed in a great mug that says, if you torture the data long enough, it will confess. You guys familiar with that? You've heard that one? So this is what's at stake. All right, so bingo. Here's the rules as we've defined them. Everyone's going to get a bingo card if you want to play. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put up first one data story and then a second data story. And for the first, I'm going to go through the data story, and we're going to ask you to identify. We have words in each of the boxes. There are 25 boxes. If you see something on the data story that is a concept that I've covered, you raise your hand. Amanda's going to call on you. That makes it unbiased, I believe. and then you say what the concept is that you see. And then if that's right, if you got one, everyone who gets that thing gets to exit off, gets the box. I think that's how bingo works. So is everyone familiar? We comfortable with this? Questions? There's a lot at stake, so I want to make sure the rules are clear. You raise your hand when you see something that is one of the concepts, and especially if it's on your card, and you get called on, you get to X that off. So, do we have is there a free square? All right. We ready? Some people are running for the doors. Can't win if you're not here. I know that. All right, we ready? I think we are. All right, I'm going to show you this. All right, this is something a data story we put together. This is what I mentioned earlier. It's about Twitter data. One moment, I'm going to explain it. I know you're so excited. This is fantastic. It's got Twitter data in it. It shows, it's really about momentum that different candidates have based on the number of Twitter followers they have. So we'll take a couple hands, and then I'll scroll down through it a little bit more. Where did Amanda go? Come on forward. To call on people. Or, yeah.
Yes, a beginning.
It does have a beginning. We could say that. Good data story has a beginning.
User relevant. I see it. There were so many candidates. How do you
And I would argue the ability to choose, sorry, I didn't hardly get into this. The ability to choose the candidates you want to look at is user relevant. It's two. Everyone marked off user relevance in the beginning. Go ahead. Set the context. Yes. Good. Uh-oh. If we're done after 5, it's not going to be the point. Wait, you got to call on someone else. Yeah. Did you? I agree. It's super purposeful. Has a purpose. Purposeful. I get to be the yeller of this.
user choice?
Yes, you got that. There is user choice. Let me scroll a little bit through this so that you have a chance to see. Did you raise your hand? I don't remember. You might get kicked. Were the rules not clear? We got, is visualization, are we going to accept visualization? Okay, very good. Okay. Less chart junk. That's definitely giving you that. If you call the same person too many times, they're just going to run their line. I'm just telling you. Oh yeah, look, there's Joe Biden of all people. Yep. Wait, I feel like we're making progress, so I'm gonna go to another one that I recently found that is a little bit more data science-y for this community. This is something the economists put together. They put together a model to be able to come up with a probability of whether someone would vote Democratic or Republican. Let me scroll through this a little bit. This is, they give you the opportunity to choose characteristics, and or randomize those, and then it will tell you how those random things are going to change. That person is definitely voting Democratic, likely Republican, almost entirely Republican. All right. Yes, sir. Oh, yeah, I just did that. We are. Look at that. It's a little faster than I thought. What is your name? Logan. Big winner, 2 books. There you go. Nice job. All right. All right. Sorry, it's only one prize. All right, that is really what I wanted to share. So let's open things up for questions. No, it's hard.
So for context, earlier you gave an example about flex layers. When is too much detail on what that target is? So, how can I go way down the rabbit hole explaining what the definition of flex is?
Oh, yeah, great point. I would view it in the way that you would view writing a paper where you would have an appendix on that kind of stuff. So if you spend too much time on the context and setting things up like that, and certainly it's important to define your metrics and have those answers, but if you spend too much time on it, you are going to run into a situation where people haven't gotten to the good stuff and they're still reading through what this thing is about, like a research paper or something like that. So putting some of that detail in an appendix, making that context pretty punchy and like core to the point is probably the better approach.
How do you balance the thing that came up with me on a couple of visualizations was skepticism? Not to be like too negative about it, but
Yeah.
as we're going to progressing towards a conclusion to our story, like for skepticism on this one specifically, but like for the climate change one, they have some kind of model or some kind of forecast that's forecasting the 59 days by 2036. So how do you balance, our responsibility to both consolidate the data on our end, but also allow the users to be able to dive into it and draw their own conclusions based on that data?
Right. Well, that is a hard one. So on the one hand, I found that by giving some flexibility to the users to be able to interact with the data, you're sending a message to them that you're willing to let them to have this be sort of a dialogue about the data. So you're not. I think that the skepticism especially comes up when you read something and you feel like you're not doing this together with the author of it. So I think that flexibility I think goes a long way in being able to get people to do that. The only other thing I'd say is that it's a lot of stuff I didn't talk too much about, but it's about your audience and knowing your audience and understanding how they're going to react to you. Because if they're starting from a point of skepticism, then you would be telling a different story to sort of address that than if you've already built up a lot of trust with them, I would say. Is there another? There you go.
What are some steps that you take to refine your story? So earlier you talked about jotting down, what you want to
Yeah.
put out, and then as you start building it out, maybe you change metrics. So what are some of your steps?
I think when you write it like that, and I had a slide in here that sort of gives you kind of a template for an abstract of it. You've created a very concise description of what you want to say in your data story, and that is a good object that you can go talk to other people about and gather feedback before you're giving them so much that you've sort of gone all the way down there. So I think that's sort of like checking with people whether it is answering the right questions, whether you're focused on the right stuff, is a lot easier task to ask of people when you're gathering feedback early on.
Back to the issue of making actionable data, there might be a chance that when we want to suggest an action, we imply our own personal opinion into the action.
Yeah.
For instance, a data generation
Yeah. I feel. I mean, this is an important and challenging theme. Is the balance of how much you're telling versus guiding someone through that. I think I think you. If you ask, this is all going to end up in some gray area, but if you're asking that person who doesn't work with data to be able to explore that data on their own, if you put the burden on them to be able to explore that data and then find the insights and then know what they should do with the insights, you're asking them to do a lot and they won't likely do it. So this is a little bit of why I think of it, this analogy of the Safari Guide. The Safari Guide is not saying you need to take a picture of that lion over by the water. That's the picture you should take. Safari Guide is saying, I'm going to take you to a place where there's going to be a bunch of interesting stuff. And then the person who you're bringing along on that safari, they still have some choice in the process. So it's a balance of like, how much are you just driving them directly to something specific versus can you give them some flexibility? And I think it's also important to be explicit about what is totally your opinion on things or where you're making recommendations and why you're making those recommendations. This sort of goes back to like how objective, or there's going to be a subjective nature to it, but you don't want to hide that if you're being very subjective on something. Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about your story and how you ended up in this space?
Thank you. I sure can. Let me think back. As a boy, so if I were to go way back, I would say my dad was an artist, and my mom was an educator. So in a lot of ways, visualizing data and trying to explain data to people is a little bit of like the environment that I grew up in. If I were to not go so far back as that, when my brother and I started Juice, we were in kind of the data analytics business, doing analysis and trying to find insights. And just the part that we found really fun and compelling was trying to take on this challenge of getting people to actually engage with the data. Because we've kind of seen if you just present the raw data, people are not going to get energized by it. And I think we did a few projects early on where we just felt like if we are creative, we bring more creativity to how the data is communicated, it really lights up the audience and gets them to take it much more seriously. And I think that just sort of got us rolling in this direction. Yeah.
So I'm kind of new to this. So when you were talking about writing out your stories first, is there a resource that you would recommend that might show examples of what that product looks like?
Oh yeah, sure. Let me see if I can find you. I have one thing that I zoomed over in this version of this presentation. I don't know. I have so many slides. Here's a hidden section. Yeah, so this is, oops. This is an example. So one of the things that this is sort of a Mad Lib style way to think about it that consolidates a lot of the stuff into saying like, if you can define what the topic is and who your audience is and some of the key questions, you can sort of fill out this structure, which will give you a very concise way of describing the data story that you want to convey.
Are your slides going to be available?
I will make my slides available, yes. And I'm being recorded, so if you really want to watch it all again, or you can skip to the end and then see this, what's going on.
Yeah, so time, I want to say thank you, Zach, for presenting it. And,
Thanks.